Hey everyone, welcome to the OptiSpan podcast. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by Emma Payne, CEO of Texts, a software company that delivers grief support globally. And we're going to talk today about grief, which I think is a really interesting and probably under-discussed topic. And particularly, I'm interested in how grief impacts us from a health perspective. I'm a biologist by training, so I think immediately about how it might be impacting our biology and the biology of aging. And also want to talk about, strategies that people can take both in recognizing when they may be experiencing grief, how to manage it, cope with it, and about some of the stuff you've been working on at Texts that may facilitate that. So again, thank you for coming down today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Maybe a good place to start is just to sort of give your sort of overarching perspective on grief. How do you even define grief? Like, what is it and what does it mean? And, what are some of the ways that it can impact people's health?
One of the ways that I like to think about it is as lost connection. When you're grieving, you've lost connection with a person or a job or whatever it is. You've lost this connection that was a big part of who you are. So it's a severing. Another definition I've heard that I really love is that grief is the distance between what you have and what you wish you had. And it can be devastating. In the field of thanatology and in death, dying, and bereavement, people talk about grief as the equivalent of a blunt force trauma to your body.
Yeah.
You can't see it, but everything is impacted. So your risk levels for both morbidity and mortality skyrocket in grief. The things you might expect, like sleep disruption, inflammation, stress, but also things that are surprising, like a 1.4%, I think it's 1.4 times incidence of type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
More likely to get cancer.
Huh.
Men have a 21 times higher likelihood of heart attack the day after a spouse dies.
Wow. So very acute. Like this is sort of almost an immediate response there.
And the first 6 months being by far the most high risk.
Interesting.
So it's this extraordinarily vulnerable time, and it comes because you've lost connection typically with someone that you loved, that mattered to you a lot. But unlike if you're in a car accident and have actual blunt force trauma, there's nothing that you can see, and we tend to all try to pretend it away. Like, right. I'm just going to somehow set this aside and get through it or not talk about it. So then we get into long-term health effects, right? I mean, grief impacts everything. Our eating goes crazy. You're either eating too much or not enough. Your sleep goes haywire, either chronic fatigue or, can't sleep at all, lying awake night after night after night. Movement, exercise falls apart.
Sure.
And then on the social connection pillar, it's this wildly isolating time. When we're grieving, we're often at the most socially isolated that we've ever been, especially if it's a spouse who's died, right? And that was your primary connection. Right. So it sort of definitionally strips out all the things that we usually do to keep ourselves well.
I think it's interesting how, that framing of grief intersects so well with like the pillars of health, the way we think about it, right? So, you said grief, one way to think about it is actually a loss of some important connection in your life, which is directly in that connect pillar, but that can impact, movement and eating and sleep quality, because those things are all interconnected. But then you made this point about social isolation, right? So there's the loss of the connection itself, whatever that loss is. But I correct me if I'm wrong, but I also would think that particularly, like you said, loss of a spouse or loss of a loved one, there's a social isolation because oftentimes people don't know how to interact with you. And so they kind of pull away, right? Is that something that you see oftentimes?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's what led me to start this company. Not so much my own grief, but the experience of seeing how ill-equipped we are functionally as a society to support each other during this completely natural, typical experience. We are all going to grieve. If we've done a good job at making social connections in our lives, if we're living well,
right.
you are absolutely going to have this
Right.
experience.
You're going to lose people or
And
animals.
so, yeah,
or,
you know, you're severing connection.
Yeah.
You're experiencing a severed connection because you did a good job of building connection. But then we all vanish into our hidey holes and no one knows what to say. And so you feel you've lost your actual connection, but people freeze. And so you hear, I mean, we all day and every day hear from grievers, subscribers who say, no one calls me. They're telling me I'm crying too much. I know I'm just making them upset because I'm talking about them all the time. It feels doubly isolating. There's the actual isolation.
Yeah.
And then there's this pretty significant social isolation that comes along with it.
Right. And there's almost, you know, an acute phase, like you're talking about, there's this blunt force trauma that you suffer from that blunt force, and that has an impact over the short term. But then there's this much longer term, for some people, years, I'm guessing, of, you know, degraded health and both mental and physical.
Yeah. So in the first, risk is particularly high in the first 6 months, much higher for men than women.
Do we know why that is?
For a host of reasons. I think men are less likely to be doing other things that might, they're less likely to seek out that social
and men have
support.
In general, it's a generalization, but have less connection, especially as we get older, right?
Yeah. I also think that grief support tends to have been mostly created by women and for women, and it's not necessarily the right stuff.
Right.
In grief, there's sort of 2 types of grievers that we talk about, and of course people are a blend of both, but an instrumental griever would be more typically a man, and they would be called like movers and doers. Like, I want to make a checklist, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to go out and exercise, I want to move and do stuff. And then on the other end is an intuitive griever, and you can think of them more like the feeler or the spiller, like I just want to talk about it, I'm going to journal and so on, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of traditional grief support fits into that intuitive bucket, and leaves out all the more instrumental grievers who, I mean, I think I was a blend of both when my husband died, but a big thing for me was like, okay, what am I going to do about it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to make this book. I'm going to collect stories from his friends. I'm going to do things to bring myself through this journey. So I also think, men tend to seek out less of the support, but also, in fairness, the things that are there are often less suited for them, which is a bummer because they're also significantly more impacted on all of these morbidity and mortality measures. You know, there's a stat about like how the broken heart syndrome is a real thing, and this men are like 21 times more likely to die the day after their spouse have a heart attack. I mean, just huge risk, but little support.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, thinking about myself, I'm definitely instrumental. Is that it? Yeah. Much more likely to react that way to grief. And I absolutely know if I was to lose my wife, like I'd probably die. Like, I mean, really, I think that's a real thing. So
people have, it's a really, well, back to the blunt force trauma. Like when, so my husband died by suicide, and I had never been to therapy before that and would not have considered myself anyone who would. But I remember sitting in this therapist chair thinking genuinely I was going to somehow die. Like something, I wasn't going to be able to continue in some sort of manner. Like, and he looked up the suicide of a spouse in the DSM, and he told me other things that were in the same bucket in terms of pain level, and one of them was being in a concentration camp.
Wow.
And I remember feeling relieved, actually. I was like, okay, so yeah, I can't remember how to tie my shoes, but if I had just come out of a concentration camp, or if I just had a blunt force trauma, I would forgive myself these things, and I would just understand, like, my brain is adapting to an unthinkable loss, and my body in every regard, inflammation, stress, sleep, like everything's thrown out of whack. And I would have just given myself more grace, to just have that deeply painful experience.
Right.
If your spouse dies, I mean, that's really, really, really difficult.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm glad you framed it that way, because I think, you know, most people, even though grief is something that, like you said, everybody who's got significant connection is going to experience at some point in their life, we don't think of it in the same way as some of these other traumas that, we would give ourselves, like you said, some grace, or other people grace.
And we
like
give
if somebody gets
other-
hit by a car, you understand what happened to them, and you can appreciate the physical trauma that goes along with that.
We're
right?
not, and we don't like to see the people that we care about in pain, so we try to quickly make them feel better, which is arguably one of the worst things that you can do, and we can talk about that more in terms of what you should do, but it's interesting. I mean, like at my husband's funeral, people are like, well, just don't do things that remind you of him. I was like, okay, well, I'll stop brushing my teeth and seeing the color blue. Do you know what I mean? The ridiculous idea that you can just not experience it. There is no such thing as there is no path that includes avoidance. You're going to have to process the pain.
And if you try to avoid it, it's probably going to pop out when you least expect it, or even if you don't, right? Again, I mean, I've shared on the podcast, and we've talked about, when I lost Dobby, our German Shepherd, this is going on, 6 months ago now, but it's legitimate grief. Like, it's very much, I believe, like losing an important human being. And, I had this experience probably 3 weeks ago, and I got, obviously the pain decreased, it got better. I was driving home from the store, and I was just suddenly hit by this wave of emotion, and like started crying in my car thinking about him out of nowhere. Right. So I don't even know that you can avoid it.
I don't think you can.
Yeah.
And on the other end, there's the sort of rumination path, which also leads people into all kinds of, long-term, complicated, prolonged grief situation. If all you do is think about it, that's going to block your recovery. And if you try to never think about it, that's going to block your recovery. So somewhere in between lies, what it takes to grieve in a healthy way, which you can. The good news is there are things you can do about it.
Yeah. So what can you do?
There's so one of my favorite, there's about 20 current theoretical models of bereavement, but and lots of different ways to think about it. But there's something called Warden's tasks of mourning, which I think are a very sensible model. And so the first task, and you don't have to do them in order. You're going to do them lots of times. You're going to do them 6 months later when you're in the car, right? Whenever and however, there's different ways to accomplish the tasks, but one way or another, you're going to have to do them. So the first being just accepting the death. And at work, we have all the time where someone starts to sign up for support, and then subscriber support will reach out and say, hey, why didn't you finish signing up? And usually it'll be a man who says, I just can't put her name in. I just can't say it. Like, they actually can't say that their wife has died. Can't actually say it. So that super basic idea of just accepting the grief. It's why bereavement thanatologists are very nervous about all these like AI chatbots where people are downloading their mom's texts and continuing to talk to her, because that's blocking. That's going to block your recovery.
Let's come back to that. Can you just say that word again, though? Because it's sort of a new word that many people probably haven't heard.
Thanatology?
Thanatology.
Yep, study of death, dying, and bereavement.
Okay.
Yeah, really interesting field of study that I knew nothing about a decade ago. But I am here to tell you that thanatologists are amazing people.
Yeah.
Really interesting perspective on life and death and the world. Yeah.
Okay. So accepting.
Yeah, so you got to accept it. There's different ways to do it, but you're going to have to accomplish that task one way or the other.
Yeah.
And then the next one is process the pain.
So, sorry though, for people who may be struggling or will struggle in the future, like, what are some tips to get to the point of acceptance?
Well, so there are different things that you can, this is sort of back to that instrumental versus intuitive, right?
Yeah.
For some people, it is good to just like journal, talk about it, find someone that you can share your favorite memories of your wife and come back to a way of acknowledging that she is gone. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it means, you know what, get someone to come and help you clean out the closet. Where are you going to donate the thing?
Right.
Accept that she's
the
not there.
actual pragmatic things that need to be done as well.
So for some people, it's talk about it. For some people, it's pragmatic. But one way or another, you need to accept that that person is absent from the world, and trying to, download her texts from the last 4 years so that they can keep coming back to you is going to block that healthy process that needs to happen somehow.
Right. And is there is there a time frame for acceptance? I mean, obviously it's going to be very individual, right? But I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is it possible to rush that, to try to force acceptance, or is it something people should try to do as soon as
you can optimize your grief experience? I mean, there are things that you can do, but, and this sounds very cliche, but it's also true, which is just everyone grieves differently.
Yeah.
Every relationship is different. Every love is different. Every person has a different background and history of what loss they've experienced before.
Right.
So one of the reasons I think that grief is isolating is that everyone has an opinion about how you should grieve.
That's one of my
pet peeves. So
if
it's like, oh my goodness, you're still crying and it was just a dog, like that's disenfranchised grief. There's a whole thing about why that's ridiculous.
I mean, this is something, you tell me if you disagree, but this is something I feel very strongly about, which is that, like you said, everybody grieves differently, and there should be absolutely no judgment on other people or yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Unless other people are doing something to harm other people in their grief. But in terms of the way they're reacting and what they're feeling,
because people are like,
real.
You shouldn't be back at work yet. You should be back at work. You shouldn't be we have in our content guide for our text messages, we actually forbid the word should. And then we also forbid the word still. Oh, she's still sad about that?
Yeah.
She's still sad about that? Are you kidding? Like her daughter was murdered. You're going to be sad about that for as long as you are breathing on this earth.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that you have a disorder. It means you're having a natural response to a horrendous life experience.
Right.
You can still be having a healthy grieving journey, and you can still accept that your daughter has been killed, right? And have pain from it later,
right?
Obviously.
Right.
But it's obvious in one way, but it's not actually how we all behave when people are grieving. And it's part of why it feels as isolating as it does. And it's part of why we see these sort of long-term, really pretty significant impacts for people over time for their health and longevity.
Right.
People, it's, I shouldn't bring up studies I can't exactly remember the details of, but there's a twin study of twins where one twin loses a child and the other twin doesn't. And it's very directly, the longevity is directly and significantly
the negative
different.
Impact from losing a child.
Absolutely. Yeah. And significant.
Yeah.
Grief is tough.
Yeah. Okay. So we've started to talk about ways to deal with grief, to cope with grief. Let's optimize grief. I mean, maybe that's it sounds a little weird, but it's not.
But I think it's
not
true.
A terrible thing to. It's actually probably a pretty good way to think about it.
I really think it's true. There's a reason that thanatologists and grief therapists love their work. People think that it would be depressing to work in grief. And the reason that it isn't, and that in fact it's joyful, is because it's not like someone being stuck in depression, or people progress. You come through it, and then there's the whole thing of post-traumatic growth.
Right. So let's save that for later, but definitely come back to the idea that there may be some positive outcomes associated with grief.
Definitely.
There are positive outcomes that can be associated with it.
Yeah, because there's no going back to normal. People don't, you're not going to, if your wife dies, you're not going to go back to how you were before your wife died. It'll be a different
life, yeah.
Not going to happen. So you're either going to get like stuck in a bad situation, or you're going to sort of try and optimize your way through the experience and come out stronger in some ways.
Right.
So that's true for sure. So so there's accept. You have to accept that they're gone. And then the second task is that you have to process the pain. You cannot avoid it. There are different ways to process it. And so some might be more intuitive, and some might just need to be like pumping iron every day, whichever. But you're going to have to actually process it, and not just sadness, but all the other very high emotion that's there. So there's often anger, guilt, shame, right? There's people talk about how grief is arguably, other than childhood, the most plastic that your brain is. You're firing and growing neurons, everything is messed up, and you are having to process this immense amount of pain, and you're going to have to find ways to do it.
Right. And again, we'll come back to it, but this plasticity is also potentially part of the beneficial aspects of coming through grief, right? This enhanced brain plasticity. Do we know, and I know this isn't your area of expertise, but do we know much about the sort of biological mechanisms involved in this increase in brain plasticity and what's happening there?
Well, I think it is due to the severity of a loss and then a necessary rewiring, because it's such a profound...
So your brain is actually remodeling to sort of
a new reality, right?
replaced.
Your life
Yeah,
is different than it was
got it.
the day before.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's a rewiring, and yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Then the third thing is adapt. So if you were speaking with a trained grief therapist, they would be looking to see, can this person actually go out in the world? Are they making the effort, going to the dinner party, building new relationships, trying new hobbies? Like, you have to actually adapt to the world that doesn't have that person in it. You can't just keep trying to like live in the space where they're going to somehow miraculously
Mm-hmm.
return. So
Mm-hmm.
adaptability is a real big thing. There's a bereavement model called dual process model, which says you can't just say, you're grieving, you should go for a walk. Go for a long walk, you'll feel better. The dual process model would say, first you have to actually acknowledge, looks like you're having a really tough day. Do you want to share a story about your wife? Hey, now do you want to go for a walk and walk it through? You have to, feel it,
Yeah.
and then adapt to it, and then exist in the world in new ways.
And I wonder if, again, I'm totally speculating, but I wonder if this is maybe part of the process where men in particular fall down, right? Because I could, again, just trying to think about how I would react to, something terrible like that. I could see myself accepting, kind of moving through that component, processing it. But then I could easily see myself be like, I'm just gonna do everything I did before, and I'm not going to change. And I could see myself, and I see this in other men. I'm working on this, but connection is really hard for
Yeah.
a lot of middle-aged men, right?
Yep.
And so, it seems easier to just continue doing what you're doing instead of going out there and trying to create new relationships.
Yeah. And you asked the question at the beginning about why men have so much higher incidence of negative outcomes. And I do think that's a big part of it. Like, you can't go back to normal.
Right.
So everything is now if you want to optimize for it, then accept the dinner party invitation.
Right.
Even if you don't want to.
Right.
If you really want to optimize, then you're going to have to adapt, and you're going to have to go out into the world and do things that you might not find that easy to go.
At least at first, it might be uncomfortable, but in the long run, that's what you're going to need to get to where you want to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the fourth task of mourning is actually one of my favorite, and it just talks about finding an enduring connection to the person who's gone. So it's not like stop talking about them. It's actually, hey, how am I going to keep this person in my life in a positive way? I'm going to start a charity, or I'm going to donate to a charity for a cause that she really loved, and I'm going to do it every month, or put my time in, or I'm going to wear my child's necklace around my neck, put photos up in a certain place, know that every year on their birthday, people are going to come together with you and remember, oh yeah, he was so much fun when he snowboarded. You have to also find a comfortable way to maintain an enduring connection with the person. So it's not about, no one ever talks about them again, which is why the socialization piece is hard, which is why it's a bummer that we're not good at talking to each other. When we're talking to people supporting a grieving person, we'll say, just say their name. You'd be amazed. And they're like, oh, but I don't want to upset them. I'm like, no, they're already thinking about Susan. Yeah. You saying, wasn't today Susan's birthday, is going to be a relief, because that's all they're thinking about.
Right.
And you give them an opportunity to share something that they loved about Susan, but also you tell them, oh my gosh, remember that birthday where Susan did whatever, told that story. Or just remembering people and keeping that enduring connection is a thing that's really missed in grief, and certainly in North America. Mm-hmm. We try to just put it aside.
I was going to say, of the four, that to me is the least intuitive, or at least the one that I would definitely miss. Right.
I agree. People, can feel like a struggle, but I think partly because societally, lots of other societies and cultures do that all the time, and they would set a seat at the table, and they would have rituals and religious timelines that would incorporate all kinds of these things, but we tend to not be great at it, and so it feels awkward. But actually, it turns out that it's super healthy and a great way to just, because when a person dies, your relationship with them does not end.
Right.
So, your partner can die, and then the next year your child graduates from high school. You still know the things that your wife would have said to your son on his high school. You still learn things about what might have happened and build her into other cars. Like, they still matter.
Right.
They haven't vanished in terms of their importance to you.
Right. Thank you. That sounds really hard, but I think it's great to have, it's really, it's good to have put a structure on this and at least be able to start to think about what are the steps to work through. And we'll talk in a few minutes about, some of the approaches that you've taken with help texts and other maybe strategies people can adopt. But one of the things that, I wonder about is, so we've talked about this in the context of losing a spouse or losing a loved one, right?
Yeah.
But I assume the process is very similar for other causes of grief. And again, maybe that's something that's worth just stating explicitly, like loss of a human, loss of a pet. I think most people can relate, pretty obvious. Extreme grief comes from that. There's lots of things that can cause grief. Is it a similar sort of process?
Yep. Yeah, again,
loss of a job.
Yeah, again, it's the gap between what you wish you had and what you have. It's the severing of a connection that mattered to you. So of course we grieve a broken marriage, for example.
Right.
How could you not? And like pet loss, these other kinds of losses tend to get put in what we call disenfranchised grief. Like, they're not taken as seriously.
Sure. Sure.
But there's still all kinds of, the same rules apply. You have to accept that you lost the job. You're going to have to process the pain of feeling angry that you lost the job and sad that you don't have the job. You're going to have to adapt because now you're going to have to go out and get a new job, right?
Yeah.
And it would be ideal if you could also remember something really cool about that job that is useful on your resume, that helps you get the next job and lets you maintain a connection to the work that mattered to you for all the years that you did it. So yeah, same rules apply. Pregnancy loss,
that's a big one,
to be,
for sure.
like, we talk all the time to employers trying to get them to just adjust their own bereavement policies, if they even have one, to incorporate other types of losses, pet loss, pregnancy loss, so on.
Yeah. So what are the big differences you see sort of within that framework in how, and we've talked about how men and women respond differently. Are there any other sort of categories of sort of individual response to grief that are worth mentioning or important in the way you think about how you optimize the response?
Like in terms of the demographic, like age?
Yeah,
for example.
what are the factors that you see correlate, but also just what are the differences in the way people respond to the same event, right, in their grief process?
Yeah, I think there's lots. A big one is for sure back to social connection, but people who have good social connection function better through grief than people who don't.
Sure, makes sense.
So age is interesting. We do quite a lot of work around teen bereavement, how mature we are in our thinking, but also that is obviously related to how much pain you've experienced before.
Mm-hmm.
One interesting thing that I read was about the first, however old you are, the first time a major grief event happens, you can think of it like the very first heartbreak you ever had, or the first time, how old were you the first time you experienced true rage? And that the first time you experienced true grief, it is like this whole other emotion that you didn't know yet.
Right.
And there's this, it's a learning,
right.
Like grieving is learning. As
how do you define true grief? Like what is different?
Yeah,
I'm just wondering.
Whichever it is to you. But the first time it really knocks you over the head.
Okay.
It's kind of like the first time anything else first knocks you over, the first time you feel love, right?
Yeah.
It's overwhelming. And it's like this. So age for sure is a big one, but not just in years, also in what's happened to you before this next thing.
What do we know about repeated grief? And is there a cumulative effect on health? Or?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity there about cumulative grief and compounded grief and complicated, if you're grieving yes, there's all sorts of other factors. People sometimes really struggle if the relationship that they're grieving was a complicated one. So how you grieve might be impacted by what your relationship was like with your dad in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
not just in the obvious ways,
Sure.
like just it's yeah, there's lots of factors, but social connection is a big one. Age for sure, prior experience with loss, things like that.
Has anybody studied? I mean, I'm sure it's been studied, but so we know different people respond differently to grief in the longevity space or the performance space. There's this idea of people who just have higher resilience, right? They're able to bounce back from a physical trauma more rapidly, right? Or a infection. Are there people who are grief resilient? Has that been studied? Does that exist? Is that a thing where there are just some people who seem to just be able to do it and blow right through it and get to a better place really quickly?
Yes, I'm sure there are. Definitely some people
I mean, I know some
cope
people
better than others.
get there, we think, but I'm just wondering, has that actually been studied, and is there an opportunity to try to understand what's actually happening there?
Right. Like, what is it that
Yeah.
actually
I mean,
is different?
maybe
I don't know.
that's a question out of left field. I think a lot of times, and my guess is, again, tell me if I'm wrong, my guess is this is a very understudied area from a scientific perspective, right? Certainly compared to other major causes of significant disability.
Yeah. So the CDC didn't start measuring bereavement until 2021. It was a pandemic.
Wow.
A pandemic win, is that for the first time.
Wow.
But it is a wow. Like it directly is to your question about what amount of research has been done and how seriously it has been taken. So in 2021, there was a report published that said that for every death, an average of 9 people, in every American death, about 9 people are bereaved. So even having that figure helped us, because we're like, okay, this is a map, 3.5 million people a year die times 9. And we know that most people will be at significantly increased risk for, heart attack, diabetes, depression, suicide. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah.
We talk about like bereavement care really should just be considered healthcare, but of course it's not even a reimbursable expense you can't go to a grief therapist and claim it back. You should be able to.
Right.
Every payer would be wise to make sure that people get a bit of grief support, because it's going to save them money, because these are the people that show up at the ER with heart palpitations and are taking antidepressants and all the other things.
Almost like a preventative care.
It is preventative care.
Yeah.
That's that's the song and dance I spend a lot of my time doing, but it is.
Yeah.
It's deeply preventative, and unlike other public health concerns like, obesity, let's say, with grief, the exact moment that the risk presents itself. So it's preventative, but also quite easy preventative and very effective, because for most people, a small amount of support actually works. It just gives people a bit of like what we're trying to do here, give people a small dose of information and things that they can act on that feel comfortable for them, and they will emerge.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's 100% preventative and easy preventative compared to other public health issues.
So is there any quantitative data on that? I mean, you said it's easy and it has a big impact. Have people tried to actually make the economic argument, the disease prevention argument in a quantitative way? Is there a resource out there that we can look at that provides that information?
Yeah, we're working on we have a couple of studies going on right now. One with University of Miami, Wendy Lichtenthal, and one with Mary Frances O'Connor, who just wrote The Grieving Body and previously The Grieving Brain at UCLA. We're absolutely, because it's one thing to show people find it helpful,
right? And
it's another thing to show, and then they spent less money on antidepressants and cost the system less.
And I mean, that's part of the. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to get payers on board, but that's part of the process, right?
But it's part of the process. Yeah. And so just in November, so 2021 is the first time CDC measured bereavement numbers, which was then just in November, the first ever congressional report
Right.
went through, which actually officially says bereavement impacts health and mortality. So even though it's obvious and the data's been there forever, it was the first time a kind of bipartisan report through to Congress. So that's exciting for us because it's getting further along down the what's been written, what are the resources, what are the lines in the sand that are definite.
Yeah.
And then the next part is exactly your point, like how do we get the cost and health outcome data that makes it an obvious preventative thing.
Right.
I mean, as a public health intervention, it would not be that difficult to make sure every grieving person got grief support because we know when it happens. It's a moment in time,
Right.
unlike others.
At least the big grief events. Yeah. Yeah. I do feel like there's probably a fair amount of hidden grief out there that we don't recognize. And I mean, again, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, I would assume that major grief has a larger impact on future health than, I don't want to call it minor grief, but of grief events that have a less impact than losing a spouse, right? How much is known about that?
Yeah, there are differences. I mean, when we're looking at sentiment analysis and seeing what comes back, it matters who they are and what they've experienced, right? Like for men who have lost a child, this is the tough stuff. This is well, and even as I was saying about the concentration camp DSM. So yes, there are measures, but then you just marry that with, but everyone grieves differently and for lots of different reasons.
Sure.
One person might struggle more than another. So, and one person might, I mean, I guess maybe it ties back to the growth opportunity. So some people will struggle more and some people for an assortment of reasons will not just survive it, but will find some growth opportunity and benefit from the growth on the other side.
So let's talk about that. So what are the potential upsides of moving through this grief process and coming out the other side?
Yeah, one is actually improved relationships, deeper compassion, more patience perhaps with yourself and others, right?
Yeah.
So people, I think I put myself in this bucket. I think became a more patient person, a more compassionate person. I listen differently maybe than I used to. For me, that was one area of growth for sure. Another would be actual personal strength, your own confidence in your own resilience. It's like, wow, I've been to hell and back.
Right.
I can handle anything the world throws at me. You just feel stronger. You feel more resilient. Another pillar for post-traumatic growth is gratitude. That it's a bit like, the sky is bluer. I'm grateful to be here. I appreciate life. I stop and I see how cute it is when the grandchild comes and does this thing, and you see that with all kinds of, that's just maturity, I suppose, as well. There's an increased strength or confidence, different connections, and also, there is an opportunity now to have a completely different relationship with a completely different person. That is hard to think about at the beginning, but it's true.
Sure. Right.
So you also have this opportunity, even back to the job loss example, you can really miss that job, but hey, you know what though? Now you're going to go out and do a different job. And from that, you'll learn different things. And I think the final pillar on post-traumatic growth is around, I don't know if spirituality is the right word, but a kind of, that people also sometimes just actually have a shift in their philosophy. Like, you know what? I can't control everything.
Right.
Turns out there are things out of my control and I just have to live with uncertainty in a way that I was previously unable to. Because if you've been a person who just tried to have everything ordered and sorted and you're like, I'm doing all the right things, I'm working out, I'm eating the right food, but you can still get taken off the rails. So
I imagine for people who have very controlling personalities that it's a sort of a shock to the system.
Yeah. So that kind of letting go
Yeah.
would be another area where there's significant opportunity to grow and learn and shift.
And what about this neuroplasticity piece? How much have people studied that? Is it the case that maybe there are opportunities to, I don't know, learn a new language, or, you know, go back to school, or, you know what I mean? Because you could imagine these periods of neuroplasticity early on in life. That's what we believe is part of the reason why kids are able to soak up.
Yeah,
so much,
I think it's fascinating. So Mary Frances O'Connor is the neuroscientist who wrote The Grieving Brain and more recently The Grieving Body. So she's done a lot of work here. There's another advisor I work with, Galen Buckwalter, and he would say that grief is a window into change. That it is precisely the severing that, and Galen's interesting because he's a paraplegic who had the experience of, okay, now you lose this and now you do that.
Right.
Like,
Wow.
How do
Yeah.
you adapt
Yeah.
significantly to a major trauma?
Did he become paraplegic as an adult?
He dove into water when he was 17.
Well, that's pretty close to being. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends on, I guess, how you view
Well,
adulthood.
yeah,
But he had a
but he's-
significant fraction of his life where he had full function,
Yeah,
and then lost that
until 17.
immediately.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he's
Wow.
an amazing guy. He's also now, well, gosh, he's got like ports in his head now from Caltech, first one in the prefrontal cortex, because he himself is a scientist and a brain guy. So so when he said originally to me that grief is a window into change, it put us down this path of trying to understand the actual rewiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the answer to could you learn a language at that time? Because in one way you're in brain fog and your brain cognitively is struggling, but your limbic system is kicking in. And
Right.
so there's like this rewiring and you are actually growing neurons more quickly because you have to.
Right.
So I don't know about the language, but you do learn and rewire in grief.
How long does that last for? I mean, is it a period of weeks, months?
Don't know. I think back to the 6-month window. Yeah, I'd have to look that up for you, but I think that a lot happens in that 6 months.
Sure.
Back to the trauma and the inflammation and all of your stress responses.
Right.
The stress responses are particularly high, which means that your brain is
Interesting. Yeah, I mean,
scrambling
it
to
sounds like
adjust.
there's a lot of interesting research to be done there, and again, maybe some opportunities for beneficial outcomes
Yeah.
that could be harnessed.
Yeah, I think it's it's actually quite cool. And back to this thing that was news to me about how positive a space bereavement is. It is, because people do survive and thrive and learn and grow and start new projects and do new things. Like it's a weirdly hopeful field.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's really interesting. I think most people would not expect that, right?
Yeah.
And yet a lot of people get stuck and they don't make it to that
Right.
better place. So maybe let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, help texts and some of the approaches that you've been taking to try to bring more people through this process.
Yeah, thank you. We're delivering text-based grief support. It's as simple as it sounds and incredibly effective. So yeah, like a 95% acceptability rate across 44 countries and all 50 states, because it turns out that if you just give people a little bit of low threshold expert advice, and if you also text the friends and family who want to help them but are otherwise hiding behind the door or crossing the street, most people, most of the time, will come through. So we text, our core product is Grief After a Human Death, and we're texting tips, resources, date reminders all year long, tailored based on cause of death, age, relationship, so on. But also a pet loss service, pregnancy loss. We have a grief literacy and support service for healthcare workers, occupation aware based on the type of grief and loss that they're seeing on the job. It's very simple, nothing to download, but it's effective.
Yeah. So I want to come back and do a deeper dive on that. If you're willing, are you willing to share like what made you decide to do this?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So in 2015, my friend died, and it was my first time being with someone as they died, and he asked me to deliver the eulogy at his funeral, which of course I agreed to do because he was dying.
Yeah.
But after he died, it was probably at that point in my life one of the most daunting propositions, because he was the best friend and also second cousin of my husband, who had died by suicide a decade prior.
Wow.
So what I had agreed to do was fly across the country and stand in front of a couple hundred people, 95% of whom I hadn't heard from when Barry died. So I got on my plane, flew, and they seated me at the front because I was speaking. So I slid into my pew, and the woman to my right said, how did you know the family? And I started to introduce myself, and she starts crying. She's like, "Oh my goodness, I'm Barry's aunt." I'm like, "I know." And she's like, "This is cousin Roy." I'm like, "I know." But people who were, because they were second cousins and also best friends, I met Barry when I was 19 and I was 31 when he died. So it was all our college friends.
Right.
And so the whole weekend through the pub night, I basically had the same conversation 100 times, which is people saying, "I'm sorry I didn't reach out then. I didn't know what to say." Too much time passed, and I felt embarrassed.
Right.
I'm sorry I didn't. So on my plane ride home, and I had already spent 20 years building web and mobile I'd done suicide prevention and youth voter registration and like care coordination, other things. And on my plane ride, I'm like, that is insane. Like, I spent 10 years not hearing from people, and hundreds of people spent 10 years feeling genuinely bad. And it's not just a net neutral,
Right.
because it's not just that it didn't happen, it's also that an opportunity for all kinds of connection and
Right.
support,
all that connection was lost. Yeah.
So on my plane ride, I just thought I can fully solve, because I'd built lots of apps and done things. I'm like, there's got to be a way.
Yeah.
Mapped it out, landed in SeaTac, fully assuming I would get onto the Wi-Fi and see that there were already all kinds of ways to get grief support, and there was a vacuum at that time. That was 2015. So started working on it in 2016 and quit my job in 2018, which everyone thought was insane.
Yeah. and did you immediately go to what Help Text is today, or was there a pathway?
When I mapped it on the napkin, I thought that our primary function would be to text friends and family with date reminders, tips, suggestions to help them help the grieving person.
Got it.
And it was secondarily that we would also text grief support.
And I mean, that makes sense given your experience, where part of it was there were all this support network that could have reached out, didn't, because they didn't know what to do. And
I mean, our supportiveness measures are through the roof, and highest of all with men, by the way. So only about 20% of our global subscriber base are men, although a year ago that was 11%. So it's growing. But when men do sign up, their acceptability retention, like their 12-month retention rate is like 90%. I mean, it's through the roof. So I thought that it was going to be about supporting the supporters, which it still is, and I still think that's a big part of what we do. But the actual grief support is a much bigger thing of what we do. And then I would say that when I mapped it out on the plane, I thought text was an MVP, because I was just trying to self-fund it off the side of my desk.
Sure.
But now, like, I just read a study that says that after 30 days, 3% of us open the app we downloaded. So I think that what I originally envisioned as a sort of MVP, what's the cheapest thing that I can self-fund, one-way text delivery, not trying to get into a two-way therapeutic back and forth.
Right.
But now our subscribers don't ask for two-way. They're like, no, I don't want to talk about it. Just text me the good stuff and I'll read it when I'm ready.
Interesting.
So it turns out that like the super low threshold, which makes sense from a public health model, holds. Like, for the vast majority of people, give them something that's discreet, low threshold, comes to them, but also make sure it's solid. It's not just one person's opinion. It's like the good stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And texting has become so much more ubiquitous and such a part of our everyday life, right? That is almost the perfect medium.
And you might
for this.
you might know this better than me, but what I have now come to learn is that unlike when you see email flowing into your inbox, When you get a text message, you actually get like a dopamine lift. And when you get a dopamine lift specific.
Definitely don't get a dopamine lift from my inbox. That's for sure.
It's the opposite, right? Or if
Yeah.
you see alerts piling up in your apps or
Yeah.
anything else.
Yeah.
But text, it turns out what I originally thought was an MVP is actually for sure a big part of why it works as well as it does.
Yeah.
Because with the lift comes a feeling of being cared for, and it also increases motivation. So your dopamine boost increases your motivation. So, and we're not just we're sending a text that has your name in it and your dog's name in it and gives you a concrete suggestion which you can take at your own time. But because it was text, you're actually more likely to do it.
Right.
And so we have good luck with actual behavior change because text is a good modality.
So, of your subscribers, how often is it the person who experienced the loss that signs up, or is it more often a friend or a family member who brings them to
much more often the griever? But in large part, that's because our business model is mostly working with organizations who provide care to grievers. So hospices, tissue banks, right? People that do organ donation, funeral providers, usually the organizations who are paying for the subscriptions are supporting the griever. But I think even on the consumer side, it's still true. People are like, I'm looking for help. And we're like, look, no wait list. You can get your first text literally in 3 minutes. Go. So still it's more likely the griever than the supporters. But we do have people, we had some girlfriends whose their friend's daughter had taken her life. And the girlfriends were just, the mom wasn't getting out of bed, but the girlfriends were like, we don't know what to do. And so they signed up and they could have added the mom, but they didn't. They actually just used it to get their own guidance and support. And there was another thing where a friend had flown to wherever her friend was giving birth. So basically her friend's baby was stillborn. And she had flown there to help with the baby, and instead was greeted with this just absolute pain, agony. She'd never been part of anything like it, and she was 27 years older. And so it was interesting with her because the mom was getting grief support for stillbirth, but the friend on the second day, and the friend was getting the supporter messages. And on the second day, we heard from her, not the mom, but the friend. And she just said, thank you for understanding. This is hard for me too. We were the only people that had said to her, wow, this is brutal and we're here to help you. And thank you for staying with Catherine right now.
Right.
Because it's terrifying.
Right. Yeah. So, I think that's actually really, so one question is for the friends and family supporters, is it a different product? So they get different set of texts? Or
different text, yeah, but it's same product. You sign up and you just say at the beginning.
I see. You tell it's
either you're grieving or you're supporting someone who's grieving, and then we'll just ask you what's the name of the person who died, if you're comfortable sharing how they died, and your texts just start.
Because I could see that supporter impact. If you've just had this terrible loss, I think for a lot of us, your first instinct is not going to be to go out and get a texting product, right? Unless you know about it and you're already aware and maybe you've gone through it before as a supporter, that's not going to be in that moment. That's not what you're thinking
what
about.
What do I need right now? I think I need some more text messages.
But as somebody who cares deeply about this person who's experiencing this grief, you might be much more likely to say, okay, I want to help
them?
Exactly. And can this product help me help them? I see that as very powerful.
Yeah, we have, so this is one of my favorite stories. This was shared with me by a hospice bereavement counselor in Ohio. And she, so their client was a woman, 68-year-old woman whose husband had died. And she was offered help texts as part of her hospice support. And so she signed up and she started getting texts. But she had a 38-year-old son who wouldn't step foot in the building and wanted nothing to do with any of it. But he agreed to get the supporter text because now we're just going to text him suggestions for how to help his mom. And as the story goes from the hospice, he got a text saying, hey, one thing you might do with your mom is think about foods that your dad really liked, and maybe you could go over and cook one of them sometimes. So this turned into a Sunday ritual where every Sunday he'd be like, oh yeah, dad really liked chili. And then he would go out and look up chili. And this is not his usual way of being, right? But because what he said later when the story all emerged was that he's like, look, I don't know what to say to her. She's just crying all the time. I don't want to go anywhere near her house.
Yeah.
And so then now you've got the bereaved 68-year-old woman whose son doesn't want to come anywhere near the house. And then you instead...
Which is a totally normal human situation, right?
It's totally understandable, but he still thinks that his job is somehow to take her pain away or make her not cry. But in fact,
that's a very male view.
Yeah, but it turns out that he is comfortable looking up the ingredient. Now we're back to the instrumental griever. Yeah. But I will go out and get the ingredients for chili and show up and talk about how dad liked chili. Well, then his 13-year-old daughter was like, actually, now it seems like dad's having fun at grandma's house.
Yeah.
So she got in on the action, and this became the way that this family instrumentally processed it, right? And it's a simple story, and all we did was text super basic tips. Like, I mean, really, I don't know what could be more low threshold than that. But it turned out that for that 38-year-old man who would never in any universe have signed up for grief support, even though his dad had died,
right,
he would sign up for tips.
And it probably helped him through his grief process too. Of course it did. Right? Yeah.
And so then, exactly. Yeah, that's where I was going to go next. So he signed up for help to help someone else, but then you're still getting now expert grief support to your phone all year.
Yeah.
So
very cool. So one of the things that this conversation has made me wonder about, you mentioned how you find that a lot of people don't want at least say they don't want the interactive piece. They'd much rather just get it, process in their own time, act on it. And I wonder, with the sort of, proliferation and exponential increase in the power of these new AI tools, right? I'm sure you guys have thought about, do we try to incorporate large language models and chatbots and things in? So kind of what are your thoughts there? Because it sounds like that would maybe run counter to the idea that people maybe don't want that. But on the other hand, maybe some people do, and you could see potentially some really powerful applications there.
One of the, I thought, most, in a way, funny campaigns that we ever ran was this whole thing about, for people who don't want to talk about it, sort of doubling down on, not everybody wants to talk about it.
Sure.
Like, there's such an assumption. I was at a behavioral health tech conference last year, and it was just AI company after AI company. We raised $40 million. We're building this AI to, do this, that, and the other. But that comes from the assumption that everybody wants to have a back and forth and talk about it.
Right.
So that's one thing. But also, we actually just hired an AI engineer today on my way down to Seattle, because for sentiment analysis, for crisis response at scale, for trying to get very, very, very good at understanding, hey, this person is more instrumental, let's feed them more of that. So we're not using any Gen AI to talk back and forwards to a vulnerable population, and none of our customers would ever allow it. I mean, the procurement cycle that we would go to sign a large health provider,
because of data privacy,
but also it's a definitionally vulnerable population. So you would never trust an AI to hallucinate anything that they might say.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And because we're one way, it's everything is vetted, everything's been through the lens, everything is very safe, but also it works. So I actually think I'm actually really excited about some of the ways that, like, an LLM can pull from a whole history, because we text people for a long time.
Right.
We could see, okay, here's the history. Are they at risk? Hey, it's midnight and he just texted back, I just want to be with my wife right now. So right now we have human beings trained human beings looking for crisis and sentiment response. And so we're looking very carefully because some people are at risk.
Right.
So I think there's some cool things that AI can do in that way, but the Gen AI idea of people talking back and forwards to an AI is still, first of all, it's a big assumption that that's what people want.
Yeah.
But also it comes with risks, and our subscribers like knowing that there's actual people there.
Sure. I totally can see that. I do think, the even just in the short period of time, the LLMs have come a long way.
For sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, there are risks. There are also risks with a human being. I mean,
Yeah.
people can say the wrong thing too.
One of the things that I think AI hopefully will do really well, because most therapists don't have any training in grief and loss. So then
Right.
we have people being
Right.
misdiagnosed with depression, for
Right.
example.
Right.
So I've seen some really cool models where AI is scraping data and helping the therapist to not misdiagnose or, right. There's apart from anything else, the number of people dying and needing grief support is doing this, and the number of trained people to provide the support is doing that. So something, whether it's AI, whether it's help text,
Yeah.
other things are coming in to fill a need. And I do think there's some cool applications. As I said, I'm fairly optimistic about the things that AI can do, because right now we have a massive gap. People just don't get support at all, and that
Right.
doesn't end well.
Right.
So let's do better than that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I see huge potential, but like you said, there are also some ways that AI could be applied that might be counterproductive. You talked about trying to upload, all of your wife's texts and at some point video recordings. Like, God forbid your wife or your husband is a podcast influencer, right? So you've got all this video out there. So you could create an AI avatar that, and then try to go on continually, avoiding the fact that
And
this
the thing
person's
is
gone.
that the data that you trained the AI on doesn't know the thing that happened the year after they died and the year after that.
Right.
Like, I think that
Yeah.
the thought of my children relying on me for advice for something that is happening to them 5 years after I'm gone, when I know nothing about the world at that point, is a bit unnerving. But also, it does block the tasks of mourning that have to come along.
Yeah.
And we also do, because we're doing all this like AI sentiment analysis work, we're working with lots of different models and looking at Hugging Face and this and that, and we haven't found any that are anywhere near as good as our data for actually getting it right. They're way off because the phrases, the things people say, how they say it, what's happening for them can sound alarming. If you're not trained in suicide prevention, a lot of things sound very alarming.
Oh, sure.
So we will be building our own because our data is just much, much better than we've been able to find yet.
Yeah.
A grief-informed AI, I think, be really powerful. That'll be useful for lots of things.
Yeah.
Because, a good example is the I just want to be with her. Like, that's an alarming sentence if it's coming from someone who has suicidal ideation, whose wife has died in the last 6 months, who, but it also might just mean, I just want to talk about her right now.
Right.
I just miss her. I just really miss her.
Sure.
And people will text back like, every time I get in the truck, I just see where she's supposed to be sitting. Okay. Just let a human, and then we as human beings, my human team can say, we hear that and we know how tough it is. And thanks for sharing. And that's often plenty. That's all they need, actually, an actual person to know that it was heard and to reflect back that it was really hard.
I think it's an interesting question. Will AI ever be able to fill that piece? I don't know the answer. I mean, culturally, we're going to evolve very rapidly over the next few years and find out, but I don't know the answer. I mean,
we haven't talked about this, but we have another whole product, which is for caregivers, specifically around terminal illness. So if you're caring for someone who is dying, even if they've got years to live, but you understand them to be terminal, we have texts for anticipatory grief, patient care.
Really interesting.
We move to a daily cadence when they're actively dying and say things that when I was bedside with a dying person, I was like pretty much every other person. They've never done it before, and the whole thing is scary. So the things that we say and then transition them to bereavement care, like, this is just not going to be replaced. Being able to sit with someone as they die, being able to hold their hand and think how to just hold their pain. This is a very human thing. Which is why we're texting the friends and family too. Like, we're helping that girl stay with the friend whose baby was stillborn. That's what actually forged the friendship of their life that will never go away. Right. Like, that's and the same with the 38-year-old son, and it's a human thing at the end.
Yeah. That caregiver piece is seems also immensely important, and something that so many people go through. My mother-in-law, went through this with my father-in-law, and it was probably a years long process, but I
Right.
think even for the last 8 or 9 months, like, it was clear the trajectory, but nobody knows how long it's going to last. And fortunately, she handled it really well, and she's come through the grief process, I think, in a healthy way. But I think having that kind of support through that,
Anticipatory grief is really, I think, yet another thing that we're not good at talking about. But
yeah,
if you have if someone dies suddenly in a car accident, 100% of your grief happens after they died suddenly in
right,
the car accident.
right,
If your person had Alzheimer's for 6 years
right.
and then
You have
died,
a lot of
X
grief leading
percent of
up
your grief
to
happened there, and
yeah,
doesn't mean the sum total of the experience
right,
is harder or easier. It
right,
just means that they were divided
right.
up
And
differently.
also that anticipatory part is often, again, depending on the situation, coupled with, exhaustion, because you're caring for this person and you're trying to care for yourself and whatever else you have going on in your household and all the other stuff.
Yeah, the
And
support that we have for people, particularly caring for a partner with Alzheimer's, like things that go on a long time and are exhausting,
yeah,
I think are really powerful. One of our expert contributors is a woman named Barbara Carnes. Barbara Carnes is a hospice nurse who wrote a book that has sold 30 million copies, and it's this simple little book that hospices give to caregivers when their person is dying, when they enter hospice. And
yeah,
so now we text this stuff out instead. Barbara says it's like having, as in, that help text is like having Barbara in your pocket. Um, but for me, it was mind blowing to realize that there's decades of wisdom about death and
yeah,
dying and bereavement, right?
yeah,
This happens to everybody.
yeah,
It's
right,
not rocket science. It's a field. There's wisdom. Um, we're just doing a efficient job of getting it to people in a way that they can take it on board.
right. And I mean, I think, as you said, this is really important. It happens to everyone, and yet it's something that we typically, very few of us, you're obviously doing this, but very few people actually try to take accumulated knowledge to make have the best outcome that they possibly can. We do that. We do that in all sorts of other areas
Right.
of our lives,
Yeah.
and yet we don't do it here.
Yeah, but we
So
don't do it here.
yeah,
It's weird. And married to that is the problem, which no one else is good at supporting us when it happens either, because
right,
we don't like to see each other in pain.
right,
So we tell our
right,
child to just cheer up, or don't think about him.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
Actually, that raises a question I was wondering about: is how or is it different, the strategies that you apply through help texts or otherwise, if the griever is, say, a teenager or a child versus an adult, young adult versus an
Quite
old
different.
adult.
We segment on age
Mm-hmm.
quite a lot. So yeah, we have a young adult series, a teen series. We work with people like the Dougie Center, who are world renowned for supporting grieving children.
Yeah.
We have seniors. We have all the buckets in between. Because even if you're talking about someone who's widowed, it's different what you might say to someone who's 80 and widowed versus 30 and
Right.
widowed.
Right.
So yeah, we have lots and lots of parameters
Right.
for what we say and to who, and timeline. When I started the company, I naively thought people will sign up when someone dies. Turns out people will sign up when they're in pain.
Mm.
And that might be, they might expect to be in pain the first year, but when they still can't function the way they want at year 3,
Yeah. And
they're
they're
like,
like,
oh,
I can't deal with this anymore. I
I
have to move.
need to
Yeah.
do something.
Hmm.
So 3 years, 5 years. We have people who
Interesting.
sign up and be like, my mom died when I was 16 and now I'm 50.
Wow.
So we have time since the death, but also time since the sign up and age and
Yeah.
all kinds.
Which just goes back to everybody grieves differently and
Yeah.
everybody's journey is different, but there are some common strategies that can be applied.
Yeah. And they're, the cool thing about the strategies, the cool thing about those tasks is there's lots of ways to do them. You do not have to sit and go to therapy. You really don't.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
You do not have to talk about it if you don't want to. Truly, you don't. You're going to have to find other ways to make your way through the acceptance and the processing the pain and adapting your life and finding that enduring bond with them. But there are as many ways to do it as there are people out there looking for a way through. And I think that's sort of part of the problem, right? People think, well, this is really painful, but I don't want to go into a basement and talk to a bunch of strangers about this painful thing.
Right.
So therefore they do nothing. But
Right. Yeah.
turns out a little bit goes a long way.
So do you have, aside from signing up for help texts, or maybe in addition to, do you have any advice for people who may have a friend, loved one who is grieving right now? What can they do?
Say their name. That's it. It's so powerful and so easy. It might be hard the first time, but you'd be amazed by how the third or fourth time that you show up at your buddy's house for a beer and you're like, geez, I was just really missing Ken this weekend. It was so much fun at the Super Bowl last year.
Right. So when you say their
there.
name, you mean the name of the, if it's a person who's lost, but if it's not a person or whatever,
yeah, whatever
just call it out. In obviously hopefully a positive way.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay.
But it's underdone and just a nice muscle to build and then get good at using. People find it very difficult at the beginning. Often they're like, oh, I don't want to upset him. Or maybe he doesn't want to think about his wife right now, or, but it's sort of this like habit or a muscle that you can build. And for 99.99999% of people, they will be grateful and relieved to know that you miss them too. Hey, you know what? He misses her too.
That's great advice. What if the person's like, I don't want to talk about so-and-so the first time?
So the next piece of advice is it is not your job to make them feel better. You cannot anyway, because this deeply painful thing has happened. So just listen, just take their lead.
Okay.
Just follow what they want. If they want to talk about it, great. They're back to there's no should.
Yeah.
Hey, I was just swinging. I'm in your neighborhood. I just grabbed a pizza for my kids. I'm going to drop one off and hang out for half an hour if you want.
Yeah. And I think what you said there is very powerful and something that I certainly need to hear, which is it's not your job to make them feel better, and you can't, even if
you cannot.
If you want.
And I people feel so much stress and pressure that they're somehow supposed to show up and make you feel better, and then you stay away because you can't.
You at some level know you can't.
Yeah.
And then staying away is not.
We have one
the best thing you can do for your friend.
We have a text that we send that says something like, if your friend cries, you've just given them the gift of releasing the feeling. That's all. You don't need them to stop crying. You've just given them the gift of letting out that thing that needed to come out right then. That's okay.
Yeah.
But you're not going to show up. If you're showing up with the goal of them not crying or being upset,
or that you're going to
suddenly make it all better because you're going to be hilarious.
Yeah.
You're putting pressure on yourself.
Yeah.
But just to solve an unsolvable. So.
Yeah. Great advice. So where can people? How can they find help texts? How can they find more about you
Just
out there?
helptexts.com.
Helptext.com.
Yeah, we're pretty much everywhere, but that's the simplest. So yeah, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my favorite topic.
Thank you. I have really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has as well. So thank you so much for coming by today.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode of the OptiSpan podcast. As always, please leave any comments or questions below. I'm sure you will have a lot after this episode. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit the subscribe button, and we hope to see you next time on the podcast.